Well, welcome everyone. We're discussing secure RBAC and the implication of the changes that we're trying to push into Manila. And this is mostly a meeting for the reviewers to catch up and discuss what is it that we're doing, how are we going to test these changes, and what's probably a rough timeline of getting these changes in, and what are the concerns thereafter and such. So at the get-go, let me begin with a small, introduction to the whole effort, and I'm going to try to share my screen. Do let me know if you can see this.
Looks good.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right. That you can still see this, right?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. All right. So we're doing a bunch of changes in the Wallaby cycle, and the bulk of these changes unlocks the functionality, but not everything will be done by the end of the Wallaby cycle. There are some things that are going to flow into X and Y, and the reason is because none of these changes break existing clouds. That's the biggest motivation. It's the upgrade, and to provide an easy and a consistent path to upgrade across the services in OpenStack, and not really surprise anybody, break any tools that are out there. So have enough time to communicate whether we're talking, from going from release A, like for example, here's the Wallaby release. You were probably running code in Victoria, and you're now upgrading to the Wallaby release. You don't want your automation to break just because the service has decided to make all of these changes to its RBAC policies. So that's the main motivation behind spreading some of these changes over multiple releases. What you will be able to do in Wallaby is a preview of things that you'll be able to take complete advantage of in the Xena release and beyond that. So what is it that we are doing? So we're enhancing the default RBAC policies. And by that, I mean we're trying to take advantage of two concepts in Keystone. One is called the user roles, and the other is user scopes, the scopes of these roles. And so what are these scopes and these roles? I'll get into it in just a second. But these are fundamental concepts that are built on top of the actual tangible assets in Keystone, such as users. So in Keystone, you can create a user, and a user is required for you to communicate with OpenStack in any form. So once you have this user, instead of the old model was to try and give users permissions to do things, and the new and what seems like the right way to do this is to actually not is to probably adhere to something that has been around for a couple of decades now, right? Like the whole Unix model of users and having roles and having groups of users and such, and allocating your permissions and such at these roles level rather than at individual users. Because it kind of scales better, definitely, and makes things easier for automation as well as management or data management activities. And the other part of what we're doing is to allow reader roles, basically trying to allow users to be created that only have read-only access. They cannot use any of the APIs that manipulate any of the resources. And we don't have such things in Manila today, so you can only you can only be using two kind of roles. I think one is the admin role, and the other is as a member role. Manila doesn't really differentiate between any other kinds of role assignments. And Keystone also has this concept of role hierarchies. So technically, the way it implements the RBAC model is that the kind of promises that the service needs to make are very little. So you basically say readers can get hold of a list of shares. Let's say that's just an example. So readers in Manila can get hold of a list of shares. So anybody with a role assigned reader can list the shares in a project. So let's say we have a user called Douglas, and Douglas wants to get a list of shares. He can be a reader, and he can also be a regular member, and he can also be a project administrator. And that's basically how the hierarchy flows. But in the project, we're just claiming that a reader can get the list of shares. So it doesn't matter if he's actually a reader or if he's going to become a member or an admin, because reader implies member implies admin. So the permissions that are granted to a reader are automatically assumed to exist for a member and automatically assumed to exist for an admin. So that makes as a service for Manila to define these permissions, it gets a whole lot easier because we only have to think about the least privilege that we want to avoid. So yeah, if we say some reader has permission to do this, then we should remember that permission is also given to the to project members as well as project administrators and whatever else comes after that. That's the hierarchy stuff. And why do we want to do this? I think the biggest reasons were enumerated already, which was that in OpenStack for the longest time we've had the support for multi-tenancy. But when you're talking about multiple tenants, you could theoretically have tenants that don't trust each other, yet having a model where the tenant can have an administrator user as well as regular users, where the administrator user can perform a few more privileged actions on the system. And by that, I mean set stuff up for the rest of the users to use or manage things for the rest of the users. And you see this model a lot in other kinds of systems, right? You basically have, let's say you have a storage system like ONTAP. You have the concept of a VS admin. Is a vServer administrator user. Somebody who is not a regular vServer user. You can create a regular vServer user that probably has access to create a volume on the NetApp. But here's an admin that can do a little bit more. They can maybe query some statistics about the system. Maybe they can manipulate some things about the VM that as it affects all of the users, not just that particular user, etc. So that's what we're trying to do here, is to try and allow the creation of project administrators whose privilege is scoped just to that project. And so whatever their actions are affects that project and all of its members alone and no other project. So that's not possible today with Manila. We assume that an admin is an admin across the cloud. We're not going to, like for example, you want to list scheduler stats, you're an admin. But do project admins really need access to the cloud's backend details? Probably not, right? So that's the issue right now. And what else? We want read-only users to have a little bit of information. So in the past, if you were to create users with users, you only had one kind of user. It was somebody that could manipulate the system. But now let's say you want to create a lesser privileged user that you want to use in your automation, maybe in your observability and monitoring tooling. It's possible. After Wallaby, Manila will allow read-only access to certain users if you need. Okay, so what else? So how does this scoping work in this new world? Well, in the past, you would say, this particular user has this particular role, and this was the way it worked from, let's say, SX and the earlier OpenStack times until now. Even it works this way even now. like somebody has something role. So Alice, for example, is the administrator, or Carlos is a member. So these are roles. Except now with this change, we can now start scoping them on a particular target. We can say this role on this particular project. So you know that users can exist in multiple projects in OpenStack. So let's say you have Carlos, who is a member on project X, but an administrator on project Y. That is possible now with the help of scoping it. So the scope qualifies what a user can do on a target, and that target can be a project, it can be a domain, it can be the entire system. So those are your options for your scopes. So it can be a particular project, a particular domain, or an entire system. What is domain? We'll get to it in just a little bit. And how do you do this? You award your roles just like the way you would after you create your users. You can individually tag the roles that you want each user to have. If that's what you wanted to go about, that's how you want to go about it. So this is the OpenStack CLI command to manipulate your user roles. And you can see in this example that Alice is a member of Project Foo, and that's just a regular read-write user, not a privileged user. And you can give Bob, let's say, a reader role on the domain called bar, and you can give Jane the system administrator role. And so, as you can tell from this example, Jane is going to be the God mode user that we have. They can discover everything in the system. They can manipulate everything in the system. But Alice's work and Alice's focus is only on Project Foo. So that's the idea. And where does this come into play with respect to Manila specifically? So assume that you have a project, Foo, and the project has certain resources, right? Shares, snapshots, groups, replicas, networks, etc. So these are things that your users are using and have created, for instance. So anybody that has any kind of a role permission, like for example, you can be an admin, you can be a member, or you can be a reader. At this project level, now has permission to do whatever those roles imply at this project. That's what this means. So if you're a reader, if let's say Carlos has reader permissions, he can list shares, he can list snapshots, he can list replicas, and so on. But can he create them? No, he can't. So let's change Carlos's role to a project member. Now he can create shares, snapshots, replicas, etc., not just list them. Now, if you want to give him higher permissions, let's say you want to give him access to being a project administrator, then probably we can think of something specifically that a project admin can do, such as resetting state of a share. Right? It's your own share. You're able to reset the state of that share. This is something we've said only administrators can do since the get-go. So that's one example of how things will work. What's a domain scope? We'll come back to that. We'll cover system scope first. So, and system scope, this you probably can imagine is going to be across everything that impacts every single user across the entire system. And we're thinking stuff like the storage service catalog, and that's basically the scheduler stats list pools API. So you're now able to get what is it that Manila is backended with. You're now able to manipulate that as well by creating share types, by creating allowing share types to be publicly accessible, or creating private share types for a given project, etc. So what do you need? The information that you need to create these share types is now available to you because you are able to see that at a system level. That's the idea. And the same thing with service orchestration. So we have APIs that let you manipulate uh, services, such as enabling and disabling a service. Those are things that you don't want a single project administrator to have. So you want to isolate those into a system scoped administrator. And applying quotas. So here's a cloud that you want to share to with all of the projects in your cloud. So you don't want a project administrator or project member to be able to manipulate these quotas. It is only somebody that's operating at a system role that can have that needs to have permissions to manipulate these things that affect everybody in the cloud. So that's what the system scopes after. So what we have right now as an administrator role, we will have to start thinking, does this administrator uh, need to be a project administrator, or that does this administrator need to be a system administrator? So for every resource that we are looking at that says this was an admin API, we'll have to think about it that way. So can they be a system user, a system level admin, or a project level admin? That's the impact of this.
Got
Yeah,
a
we
quick
have.
question. So something like, let's say, upgrade or redeploy, where would that fall? Mm-hmm.
So all of the deployment level stuff would be a system. So a regular project administrator should not be having access or should not even need to worry about the cloud's operation, right? They are able to control their users and maybe the resources that they have within that particular project, and that's all they need to worry about. They don't need to worry about the system, and they shouldn't worry about the system because that would break this privilege separation.
Makes sense. So upgrade is all of that is under system. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So now let's shed some light on the domain scope. Well, a domain is basically a higher level concept in Keystone that Keystone has. It's able to distinguish between projects and projects that own those projects. So you can have a project hierarchy in Keystone, and there are a lot of users that actually use this in this particular way. And the reason they do that is, let's say you have a company, a massive company that has multiple organizational units, and these organizational units are each individual projects. No org should bleed resources into another org. And so they kind of trust each other, but they're not really trusting each other in a sense. So it's basically a hierarchical multi-tenancy if you think about it. And that's where a domain sits between the system and the project. So a domain could be a set of projects, a group of projects, and that domain can become your customer. Let's say a company wants an account on AWS or something like AWS, which is OpenStack, but the company has 5 different projects that it's working on at the same time. So that's possible with the help of this domain level of privilege. However, since this is basically operating at the identity level, so far we at the project level, and when I say project, I mean Manila service this time. At the service level within Manila, we've never cared about the domain. We've never had to think about this concept where a project might have a hierarchy, um, where it is related to another project, right? Or maybe it's not even hierarchy, but there are two leaves at the same level. So we've not had to think about it, and nor does any other service. So the way this is architected into Keystone is allowing all of the user interaction that needs to happen on the domains only happens in Keystone. The services themselves, like Cinder, Manila, Nova, they don't need to know anything about these domains nor worry about them. So basically, one of the biggest examples that will drive some domain level knowledge around Manila would be the hierarchical quotas. So assume that company X has an account in your public cloud, which is run on OpenStack, and so the company X has now got 4 subgroups, and so each one of those becomes a project within the company X's domain, and they will have a domain administrator and and 4 individual project administrators, just for example. And so the domain administrator now has access to seeing everything what the company is consuming, and probably has access to control resources and quotas for each section within their company. So the top level system administrator hands off a quota to that domain, carves off a quota to that domain, and the domain administrator now gets to carve it up within their 4 different organizations. So that's one possibility of how project quota hierarchies, for example, can come in the future. As you know, we're working with um, an outreachy intern to prototype unified limits for us, and unified limits is step 1 to being able to do hierarchical quotas by making sure that the quota aspect of it is outsourced to Keystone rather than within Manila itself. So that's one example. It's hard to come up with more examples in this kind of thinking where we have sufficient isolation between the projects that it really does not matter. But think about it as right now, today, if you have a domain user that wants to list resources across their projects, like for example, what are all the shares that are created across my company? There are 4 different organizations. Let me see all the shares that are created under each one of these organizations. And so on this cloud, each of those 4 organizations is a separate project, all tied together to a higher level project, which we're going to call a domain in this case. So as a domain administrator, I can see those resources and manipulate them um, as across my sub-projects. So this is something we don't need to worry about yet. There is nothing in Manila that ever thinks about project hierarchies, and you can't think of them without talking about Keystone's involvement in it anyway. So anything that comes domain stuff will probably come later, and this isn't something we need to worry about right this cycle. But how do you as a user interact with something that can do project, domain, and system scoping? So you are a user who has a particular role. So in our previous example, Carlos has a reader role on a target, right? The target being either a project, a specific project, or a domain, or the entire system. And this is how you would become Carlos on a particular cloud. So Carlos is a user that already exists. That would be the username, and he has a password, and that would be the password that he'd enter over there. And if he wants to operate on a particular project that he has access to, he would specify the project name and the project domain name, and that's how he would acquire a project token. And when he interacts with Manila using this project token, we know Carlos is interacting on that particular project. And Carlos might have been part of different projects, or maybe he's the system administrator, but we throw all of that out of the window at this point. Because he's interacting with Manila using a project level token, we're only going to give him whatever permissions Carlos needs to have at that project level. So if Carlos happens to be a reader at that project, he cannot create shares. He cannot manipulate anything that an administrator can do because he's a reader in that particular project. So that's how Carlos would interact with the system to get his token, and using that token, he would hit the API. And in the next slide, I think I have a diagram of how this interaction itself happens. But otherwise, these are the magic commands to get tokens at different levels. It's a little simpler when you're operating using cloud profiles, and I'll probably show you that with a small demo at the end. Any questions so far?
No.
Great. All right, here's an auth flow. I blatantly stole this from this thing from Lance. Lance Brackstad happens to be the person one of the people that is driving this secure RBAC effort across OpenStack. And he made this up with Nova as an example. And so, I mean, you can in your head replace Nova with Manila, because this is exactly how it's going to work with Manila as well. So at the get-go, just like we said in the previous slide, sorry, Carlos, you're going to be the guinea pig. Let's assume Carlos is interacting with the Manila API, and he wants to create a share. And Carlos is a member on Project Foo, so he'll go ahead and acquire a project token, and he will interact with the Manila API directly. The reason we're saying this directly is because we have certain components that abstract away this thing from Carlos as well. We have the Python Manila client that's able to do all of this token arbitration, etc. You don't need to worry about the token and the authentication and all of that. That'll take care of it for you. Same thing with the Openstack client. If you want to use the Openstack client handles all of the authorization and authentication for you. You don't need to worry about it. But say you were doing this by hand, you would go in and say, hey, OpenStack, give me a token. And you would use that token to hit the Manila API. And so you would basically acquire the token by talking to Keystone by saying, hi, I'm Carlos. This is my password. And this is the project that I'm looking for the token, and this is the domain name for that project. And Keystone allows you to get that token, and it gives you a massive Fernet token, right? And that token is what you will use to call into the Manila API. So let's assume that you're hitting the v2/shares API to create a share, right? So it comes down to Manila. And in Manila, we munge some of this information even before it hits the API routes layer. And that's the middleware. So we have a Keystone middleware, which takes care of validating that token. So first thing we do is we talk to Keystone and we say, hey, here's the user token. We know nothing else about Carlos. We don't even need to care about anything else about this user, but he has a bunch of information that he is using this API with. So Keystone, can you tell me everything there is to know about this user? And so Keystone takes this token. It validates that the user information that it's coming with is correct. And it allows Manila to gain all the information that it needs within a context object. So it basically creates a context object by with taking some more information from Keystone, and this context object is what we throw around everywhere in Manila, right? From there on forward. So that's how we track Carlos's interaction with the system from there on forward. So we create this context object with Carlos's name, his user ID, his project name, a bunch of information that we find useful. And then we go ahead and perform that action. That action in this case for Carlos is to create a share. So we go to our database, we create the metadata that's required to create the share, then we send it off to the scheduler, etc. From there on forward. But before we do these steps, one of the things we do after we get a hold of Carlos's information from Keystone is we ask ourselves, as in the Manila API asks itself, does Carlos have permission to use this API? And how does it determine that information? We already have role-based access control defaults in the service, and where we say that project users can create shares, project members can create shares. So is Carlos a project member? Which project does he belong to? So when we create the share, this is the check that we're doing, and that check is done with the help of policy. And by policy, I mean the check infrastructure that we get from this project called Oslo policy. So we create what is known as an enforcer object, and we basically apply the information that we have about the user to the information that the project developers like ourselves have put together, which is we say that if only these kind of users can create shares. So is Carlos that kind of a user? Then yes, we'll let him create a share. If he's not, then we're going to send back a 403 saying you're not authorized to create shares, because there is a rule that was set up by these project developers that you're not allowed to create these shares. While we say there are policy defaults, you know that somebody in a deployment can even override these policies by maintaining what is known as a policy file. And we've documented how they can do all of that already. So if there is a file and there is a policy that's been written by the system administrator, then we are going to enforce that policy and not the default that the service has. So this is how the auth workflow happens. Any questions with respect to this? All of this is common between all of these OpenStack projects. So you can literally replace Nova with Manila, and you should have the same kind of flow. Any questions so far?
Nope.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so that's all I had as an intro. Then I wanted to talk changes. So there is an Etherpad. I don't know if I have it elsewhere. Give me a second to check.
How come? Is that the Etherpad? I don't know.
Yeah, I got it. I was just trying to open it in this place.
Okay.
Oh, you shared something on chat, Tweeta? Yeah, there you go. Yep,
Oh,
thanks.
it's just the pad. No problem.
Yeah. Awesome. So this is the Etherpad, and that's the link that Vida added on the chat. Thanks, Vida. So there's a lot of changes. I guess about 29 something patches to APIs, API policies. So I'll walk you through some of those changes to just give you an idea of what this change looks like, right? So here's one for availability zones. And the only file that's changed over here is availabilityzone.py. And on the left-hand side, you have what this the policy was before. It said rule default. And if you can, I think, let me pull up a PyCharm window. So in the Manila policy.py file, we, no, actually not the Manila policy.py file. In the Manila policies base file, we actually have what this rule default stands for. So we've made up a rule called rule default, and this rule should not be confused with a role. This is just our shorthand of creating a RBAC rule. So we're just calling this rule default. Probably not a great name for it, but if you come down over here, you'll know what that default is. The default rule corresponds to Keystone's admin or owner check. And what is this admin or owner check? How is that enforced? It is enforced via this check string. So a check string is a string that has a bunch of conditions. So, and the conditions are written pretty much like Pythonic. Like you can say this or this or this and this, and each part of that check string can become some sort of a dictionary check, right? So think of the left part of this as the key and the right part of this as the value. So the way Keystone enforces this check is it has this context information. And in our example, it was this request context coming from the user, let's say Carlos, and we have everything that we need to know about Carlos. And so the first part of that check is saying, is Carlos an administrator? In that request context object, we have is admin. It is set to true or false based on whether Carlos is an administrator. Carlos never claims to be the administrator, but we can even figure that out from his project token. So that's what this first part of this check corresponds to. And the second part is project ID equals some project ID. So that particular check, the way it works is when let's say Carlos wants to delete a share or list a share or show the details of a given share, we look at the share's project ID. And we look at the project ID that's there in Carlos's context object. And if those two IDs match, then Carlos has permissions to manipulate that share, retrieve its details, or delete that share, or update that share, etc. So that's what this check here is. Do the project IDs match? So this is some sort of a default rule that we've made up. And the reason we made this up is because this is what most of our APIs are defaulting to right now. So either you're an administrator or the resource belongs to your project. That's what this rule really means. So we've awarded this rule to the availability zone APIs. There's just one of them. It is get availability zones, and it's two kinds. This thing with the way we were doing extensions in the past. And after API version 2.7, this is what the API looks like. So you can operate on these two parts if you are an administrator or if you're a project member. And that gets a little tricky over here because availability zones are not related to projects in any way. So Keystone is smart here, saying if the resource does not have a project ID, then we don't care about that second check. Right. So we were just using rule default, but this might have just been, whether you're an administrator or or a member of any project, you can get availability zones. And that's what we're doing in the new version as well, except we're now extending it to system users as well as project users. And we are applying the principle of least privilege and saying, this is a GET API. If you have reader permissions, you should be able to get to this API. And that's the new thing on lines 34 and 35. So when you upgrade to Wallaby, that's the default rule that you get. Except we also have we are also going to respect the older default, and the older default is now deprecated. So you're going to get a deprecation warning when you upgrade to Wallaby every time this API is called. So that's kind of going to be a pain in the butt that we're going to deal with during our first release. You're going to see a lot of logging going on from the Oslo policy aspect. So I think they introduced a new policy option, a configuration option that you provide under Oslo policy section. And if you provide that option, it'll let you skip the deprecation warnings that come in with the help of, through the secure RBAC effort. That's one way to do it, or you have to override the policy using a policy file. But most people that most regular deployments are going to respect the project's defaults, and they don't care about overwriting the policy file. That's what we've seen over a period of time. So if you just have the default policy, you should, and you're getting log spammed, there is a new option for you to control that log spam. But otherwise, if you're upgrading from Victoria to Wallaby and you didn't change anything else about your system, you just have had the the regular users. There is nobody operating a system scope. You're still fine because the service is always going to respect the older rule. And the idea over here is that we will respect it at least for one release cycle, and maybe two, depending on how we, what kind of feedback we see for this new way of doing things. And we are going to finally get rid of that deprecated rule. So we will enforce policies. And I'm thinking, this has got to be a cross-project effort. And I'm assuming this will either be in Xena or Y, or maybe even Z if some projects are not going to be able to do this soon enough. But until then, we'll respect the deprecated rule. And there is and you might be able to ask, why would we respect it when somebody really wants to use system scoped rules? And there's a way around that as well. If somebody really wants to only use system scoped rules or these new defaults that the services have made up, you can set an option called enforce underscore scope in your Oslo policy section. And that will make sure we don't respect any of these deprecated rules. It's just going to throw the deprecated parts out of the window, and it's only going to enforce the new rules. So that's the thing. But as you know, and we all know, we're never going to break users, and that's why we need deprecation. So this is one API, an easy one to understand. But let's actually look at a little more, something that's a little more complicated, right? Maybe the quota classes, quota sets, storage pools. Actually, let's go down, I think, and look at shares. This is the scary one because it impacts a lot of APIs. So you know that the shares resource has probably the highest number of APIs in Manila. So this is something we need careful attention to, because the new defaults might actually be against what the project thinks is happening. And according to me, this particular patch is not yet ready for review because I've certainly not been able to test it yet. So let's keep this one at the very end, even if we find everything is fine in this, it's not going to merge because of the way these patches are depending one on top of the other. The dependency is literally in this list over here. This is the order of dependency for the patches. And let's take an example from this. So here's a rule that says set public share. So we in the Stein release, we said that public shares are completely antithetical to the whole concept of multi-tenancy. And somebody creating a public share is also probably doing it by mistake for the most part, because let's say you have private project networks being used as shared networks, and you create a public share. What does that even mean? Like, nobody else has access to your network. How are they going to be able to mount this share? And why would we show it across projects and such? This was a common complaint. So in Stein, we changed the default policy for creating public shares, and we said that it's going to become an administrator level API. And even today, we actually support the older deprecated part, which is you as a regular user can create public shares and can update any share to become a public share. But with this new thing that's coming, we're going to get rid of the older deprecated default. And second, we're going to promote this API to become a system admin API. So only a system administrator, that is any user that is an administrator, that has an administrator role operating at the system scope, can create a public share. No one else can. That would be the default, and it's a sensible default to me, because a project administrator, if they end up creating a public share, they actually have no idea whether this is really accessible to the other projects at all. And these shares that they create could still be on project networks, because a project administrator has no more privilege outside of their project. So that's so that gives them that gives us the reasoning that says, this ought to be something that only a system administrator can do. So that would be the one-to-one comparison that we will need to make, the reasoning that we need to have for each of these APIs. And public shares was probably a this thing example, but you can now imagine something like manage unmanage. A project administrator has no visibility to the scheduler stats API. They have no idea how to get to the back end. They don't even know what's in the back end, for instance. So whether they're running NetApp or CFFS or EMC or whatever it is, they have no reason to know any of these. So something like a manage API doesn't need to be at a project level. It needs to be at a system level. All right. And same with unmanage. If you let project administrators unmanage something, it might create orphaned resources, and you sure want to keep them only at the system level. And the only other thing that will probably stand out is the base rule is probably going to be looking a lot like this: system admin or project member. This corresponds to what we did with what we were doing previously. We said rule admin, it's this check. If you're either an administrator or you belong to any particular project, and that is the default rule that we have for most APIs. So in the new world, the default rule is system admin or project member. So it's exactly the same as the old thing, except we're not looking at the project administrator, we're looking at the system administrator. And because you have a project member in here, the project administrator sure has the same permissions. They have a little more permissions than a project member. So they can still do this action, but it is the default's going to be for to a system administrator or a project member. What else? Oh yeah, a read-only API. Instead of saying system admin or project member, will now say system or project reader, because we don't care if a project level reader or a system level reader can have access to this particular API. But if you think of it this way, let's say this is where is list? Yeah, here's the list shares API. Who do you want in your cloud to have access to the list shares API? You want everyone to have access to the API, but they should only be able to get shares that belong to their project. So if you're a project member or a project reader, you have access to shares that belong to your project. But if you're operating at a system level and a system reader, you can now get shares that belong to all of the projects. That would be what this implies. But if you are a particular scope to a particular project, you'll only get resources from that particular project. All right. So that's a couple of examples of what these changes look like. So for the most part, it looks a lot like changes look a lot like each other, except that they touch different parts of the policy, different APIs in the policy. And Lance, the original author of this patches, did a great thing by separating these by API file, by policy file. So it makes things easier for us to review. And you might ask, the next question was, why aren't we writing unit tests for these, or rather any sort of tests for these? So the one aspect to not include tests along with the patch is to first check if everything works as expected via regression testing. So right now, whatever tests we have, do those work when the new defaults are in place? So that's one way of looking at it. The second thing is unit testing. Something like this has been a huge challenge, but it has to be done. And I'm a proponent of that. For one, I don't expect any of these changes to go in, at least without a semblance of a test that is going to come by the end of the Wallaby cycle. There's no reason for us to merge something without any sort of testing, at least. But I can give you an example of what unit tests look like by showing you what it is, I guess. So I started writing these tests last week. You can see my screen. Try and navigate to what a policy test will probably look like. Let me take a simple one, like availability zones. This is the test case, and because there's a lot of permutations and combinations to test, we're using DDT, and we're putting in a standard test kit with the help of DDT. So let's get into this file. So it's getting plugged in through this file. DDT looks at this YAML file and it conflates the test cases based on those. So the name of each of the test case denotes what the test case is supposed to be testing. Like, for example, a project member can list availability zones. A project administrator can list availability zones. And an unauthenticated user can't list availability zones. So these are 3 test cases for the existing API. And it has stuff like what is the path that we're hitting, what is the method, the HTTP method, and what is the expected status. So if a project member and a project admin can hit the get availability zones path and get back a 200 message, response code. But when an unauthenticated user hits this, that is, there are no headers, auth headers, they're supposed to get back a 401 error and stuff. Another thing that's probably interesting is, I mean, yes, the project IDs and the user IDs matter, although these are fake in the sense they matter to our test case, because at the end of the day, these IDs are what is driving the authorization and authentication. And of course, if we're hitting an API that was only introduced in version X, that would be the version we're probably targeting for our tests. Could we target more versions? Yes, we can. We can definitely add way more test cases than these are. For instance, like for example, this API was introduced in 2.7, but it exists in every version beyond 2.7. We can actually write as many test cases as the API versions are there. But I think it's a judgment call we need to make if we really need to add as many test cases, because I was looking at the code and I see that this API has not been manipulated at all since 2.7. So it's okay to test from 2.7 is what my reasoning was, to just keep it to 3 test cases so far. And another important thing to take a look at is these roles. Right now, we're not testing any system level thing. This is a test that tests the existing code. But when you see system stuff, you're now going to see another auth header, which denotes system scope as well. And I was gonna, but for the most part, the structures look the same. And what is one other thing that's different about these tests? And this was something I was not very well aware of, which took me forever to figure out, was that for all of our tests in Manila, unit tests, which test the API layer, 99% of them use the no auth authentication. We throw auth out of the window and we just use the no auth middleware. So for these tests, we had to set up a Keystone middleware, and here's the parts to set it up. The parts that we are faking is what Keystone does with the request. We're just faking that to say do nothing. So we're mocking the whole middleware layer, but we are still taking advantage of how the context object is passed around between Keystone and us. But apart from that, we're mocking everything else out. And so it requires us to do some funny things to override some configuration files, configuration options, and stuff. And what else? Oh yeah, and then this is the base test itself. We send an API request, and we get back the response, and we just do an assert over here. That's all we're asserting. We're not asserting the content of each API and stuff, because that part is already covered in other unit tests. We're just looking at the RBAC stuff, so we just have to assert the response status. Okay. So I've written a bunch of test cases so far, still lots to go, and on this Etherpad you'll see me probably also add notes like we have bugs. Because we've never had these test cases, we now discover bugs. So for example, there's this security services API that lets you play with this all tenants keyword, and while it has its own policy for that. The all tenants keyword, there's another check over there in the code that says is admin. So let's assume some administrator can go into the policy file and override the policy for that and allow a regular user to have access to all tenants. We in code still won't let them have it because we have a check that says is admin. So we need to get rid of that check. So that's one thing. And a bigger bug is an access rule can be retrieved by UUID by anyone. That's on the access rules API. So if you basically have the UUID for an access rule, you can get it. You just have to get that particular thing, and we'll get you back the permission with the access rule information. And that sucks. We have to fix that bug. So as we are going down each one of those, you can see the availability zone stuff was easy, but here's stuff for share access rules. It is every possible combination of different APIs and their interactions, quota sets, same thing. So as the API gets more complex, the number of test cases increases when we're covering all of these scenarios. So that's what I wanted to give you a view of, and let me take you back here on the other set of tests. And the other set of tests, and this is something that we're definitely interested in, is not unit tests, but tests that test the API as a whole, as a real running thing, right? Which is Keystone. So I'm gonna think Openstack Keystone Tempest plugin. Yeah. So here's what the Keystone folks are doing in their Tempest plugin, and we can use this as an example to drive our own Tempest level testing of this whole thing. Although, I mean, the tests themselves look a lot like the unit tests. They have a do request method, and all that does is it'll check the status that comes back. And the test cases, like for example, this one, no, these are not. What is this? These are ABC methods. Okay, hold on. These are not test cases. This is a test case class. Oh boy. All right, here's one. Test identity get credential. So this doRequest method handles the asserts for them, but they have to still set up a bunch of things for the test case itself, and they just go ahead and call the method to perform the asserts. It is a little complicated, but they've added the smarts back into Tempest, so they can reuse some of this authentication pieces like this. For example, give me the domain admin and the system admin roles for this test case, and I will use them in the tests to drive some automation and some verification. And in total, what did scare me about this change is it's 16,000 net lines of code to test the entire Keystone API and all the changes that went in because of system scope. So it's going to be a pain. So I'm not saying that we are definitely done in Wallaby just because of stuff like this. And until we test it completely, we're not going to claim support for it completely. Which helps us because we are deprecating it, and by deprecating it, we're not yanking it out. We're literally saying the old way is supported, and the new way, when you turn it on, is experimental because, hey guys, we've not finished testing it completely. So this change for Manila Tempest plugin may be 10,000 lines, 20,000 lines. I don't know what it looks like, but it will come once we ship Wallaby, because we're working on it after M3. But the unit tests will come in right now and before these changes can merge. I have unit tests covering everything but the last couple of things in bucket number 1. That's the availability zones, messages, quota classes, quota sets, storage pools, security services, access rule metadata, and share export locations. So it's about 10 different API endpoints that I would like to treat as bucket 1 for all of this. So Douglas, Carlos, when we come across these API changes, look for the unit tests for sure, and then of course ensure that we're passing regression as well. For instance, that would be certainly the review recommendations. And of course, feel free to discuss and debate. Is this change valid in the sense? Would you like, let's say, a system administrator to have access to this API over a project administrator? Is that the right thing to do right now, kind of a thing? So definitely ask those questions during review, and we can discuss back and forth. And at the end of this, the doc impact for all of this is going to write up that all of these changes into a Manila configuration document, which discusses what are the defaults for each of the APIs and what that allows them to do and stuff. So that's the doc part of this. And what else? I didn't have much else to talk about besides this, but I've gone on for almost an hour and 15 minutes, I think. So yeah, it's a lot of information, overload. So I'll stop now. Let me hit some screens. Okay, I'll keep this screen share on. Any questions so far?
Yeah, it is a lot of information, but I think you was able to get us to know. I mean, in the same level as you of knowledge of this, you explained this for us, so I can understand it better now than I did. And I was just going to ask about the documentation effort for this. It was something I got a bit concerned about, but you talked about creating a document and stuff like that. But do you think that would impact a lot the documentation we currently have right now, or that should have just like some warnings or some stuff like that?
Good point. I think I at some point looked at these for what is it that we have right now question, and we don't talk about it a lot. Uh, for example, we don't have any discussion of policies on in the administrator guide, which is bad. We kind of
Yeah.
assume that users just know how to use policies. But I think somewhere here we've created configuration files and we have a sample policy that's still being written into this file. And we also have policy configuration out here. So this is what this basically dumps the policy information as it was extracted a few releases ago, I think. I'm not even sure if it is up to date. So it is not very helpful right now. It just says this is what the policy is, and you make sense of this sorts. So I was going to write some prose, and the prose would talk about exactly what we discussed right now in this presentation, right? I'll probably translate that into this thing saying this is how you would create these users. I mean, go to this particular Keystone doc, which probably explains all of these much better. But just if you want to get an idea of how to interact with Manila, this is what you would do. We expect that users are either of admin kind or member, but now we also support reader. But otherwise, these are the different APIs and how each one of their policies is changing in Wallaby. That would be what I thought I'd document. Does that make sense? But that
Makes
question
sense.
about what we have currently, yeah, it's very little. So it's
Yeah,
not very helpful.
yeah, it's very little. And are there any examples of other projects that currently have already like removed the deprecation warnings and have completely moved to secure RBAC or no?
No, I don't think there are, and that that is because again something like for example Nova did this last year, and I don't have a topic for the Nova project, but let me see if
Yeah,
I
it's
can
pretty
find it.
recent.
Uh, yeah, it was the last cycle in the Victoria. Oh yeah, so here's the topic. Policy defaults refresh deprecated APIs is the the topic he tried to use, and they did the exact same thing. They just updated the check strings and moved on. They have not yet, moved completely to the secure defaults, and I think they will want to do that in a coordinated fashion across all of the projects because it gets very confusing to an OpenStack user if they need to interact with Manila in a different way than they interact with Cinder, in a different way than interact with Nova and stuff.
Yep, makes sense. It's pretty recent as well. So yeah, I think that's the questions I have for now. Let me
Yeah,
see if I think about something else.
absolutely. There is one other thing though. I wanted to show you how to enable these. So we're writing these new tests that are testing the secure defaults, but how you enable them is different. I think Cinder has an example here. Here. Okay, so here's one job. They've set up variables that say enforce scope that ties to that Oslo policy enforce scope, and they make sure that that particular job runs with the new defaults and not the old defaults. That way they check that the deprecation and all of that is just thrown out the window, So if somebody just wants to switch to the new ones, everything still works. And so when we do this, when we write all the Tempest tests, we'll also have a similar approach.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Very nice. I would say it would be pretty nice if we had some sort of input from system administrators as well, because I mean I think they could help us to give their thoughts, or I mean also possibly review. I don't see a lot of people, a bunch of
Yeah.
system administrators doing these sort of reviews, but I would say this would be pretty helpful and would help us to identify some stuff.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed. I guess having their input on the doc will probably have it more impactful than the API code, because again, I think
Yeah.
the operators doing code reviews is a wish list thing that we've had
Yeah.
for a while, right? So
Yeah.
explaining something to them, via prose has always been a better approach. And they are giving it in different parts and pieces. Since this is a multi-project effort, they understand this is coming, the secure defaults stuff, and they're excited for it because they've wanted it for a while. So they agree with the basic tenets of it, but they're not contesting the individual project's decision as to what the default policy will be, because they, for one, have an option to override it, and two, they probably want us to take the decision, or the kind of thought process that goes into, hey, what do we as a service developers feel is a system resource? What is a project resource? So we are better off making those distinctions than an operator. Um, and an operator can override those if they want. Because think of it like this, right? We made a call a long time ago saying share servers are abstracted away from end users. And Douglas probably wants to make a puppet of somebody that came up with that decision and prick it 100 times, right? Because I mean we've asked that question a lot, saying, did we really think of this the right way? But it was a decision we made as a team, and operators so far have not asked us, uh, you know, why that was so, or they didn't even care, because they trusted that we know why we're doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Douglas, it wasn't me. For one, I want to find the person that said driver handles share servers. Yep.
Was probably promoted for that.
Yeah, I know. That's the best way we can communicate all of the stuff that we care about to our end users. Driver handles share servers. Yay.
Still regarding Tempest plugin. So besides all the new tests that we can add to test all those policy changes, we will need to change something on the way that we currently create the credentials used in all tests, or just like you were showing in the Cinder Tempest plugin. We would just need to change some configurations.
No, you're right. Like the tests themselves, for example, in this case, I think this this is an empty file. Both of these are empty files. Let me see if Lance has a similar patch in Tempest. He thought oh yeah, here's one. So the tests themselves look like this. So ignore the base class. And he's, oh yeah, actually, no, don't ignore the base class. So in the base class, he sets up some certain things to do the testing itself. But here in this line, for instance, line 61 of that change, he's requesting Tempest to give him administrator credentials, one at the system level and one at the project level. And yes, they had to make changes to Tempest to accommodate this stuff, to provide these new roles by default. Right now, we in our tests are requesting 3 kinds of credentials: primary, admin, and alt, I think, or something like that. Just because of the way we've defined our testing, sometimes we check whether alt users can get something that a primary user has created, for instance. So something like that. But in this case, Tempest just makes up a project, for instance, for the project admin role. And we don't even, we at the test level don't need to care what that project is called, etc. Nothing like primary or alt or something like that. But use that project role to do something. That's how they're defining this. Okay, so here's project member tests, project reader tests. How else will we get this? Test get capabilities, test get capabilities. This test case is not complete, I think. I think he's still working on it. But here's how you would do the okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why this test says pass. I wonder if the do request will just handle it, but he's not even calling do request in this. This test case looks complete, which is that a project member can't get the pool's information. Do request show backend capabilities should fail. But yeah, I mean, when we write up the tests, you'll see an example of this, and it has to now be replicated for each piece of that matrix. The matrix really has 9 cells: project, domain, and system being the top level, row headers, column headers, and the rows are member, reader, admin. So member, reader, admin roles at project level, member, reader, admin roles at domain level, member, reader, admin roles at the system level. Except we can take that domain column and just throw it away for Manila because we don't care about domain. So member, reader, admin at project level, member, reader, admin at system level. So each of these tests will have at least 6 test cases against each API. Fun.
Okay, so in the first moment, we need to take care of these API tests, and then we need to, after that, we can work on the changing how the other tests that we already have.
Yeah.
We will use these credentials.
Exactly, and I think the other tests, the impact on the other tests should be minimal, in the sense that if we have any test where we're doing RBAC, we are actually in some of the Tempest tests we're actually testing RBAC. Can as a member, here's a negative test. Can I migrate a share? And the test expects 403, for instance. So maybe that test can remain, because even in the new world as a project member, you can't do that. But let's say you have something that currently tests as a project administrator. Can I see something that belongs to another project? That's an invalid test case in the new world, because a project administrator cannot have access to another project's resources. So yeah, so maybe we'll have some tests to delete when we enforce scope is turned on. And for the other kinds of testing that we're doing, which is we're just doing primary admin and alt credentials for most of our test cases, those can remain as it is because we're not testing RBAC in those changes. But you're right. I mean, many of them will also need to, when we say admin, we now have to ask, can a project administrator do what that admin was doing? Like, for example, create share types. Project administrators won't be able to create share types, so we might have to ask for system admin specifically when we're creating share types or listing pools or something like that. So yeah, first we'll introduce the new RBAC tests and then audit all the existing tests. I'm hoping the changes are minimal for the audit and the change part, but yeah, we don't know what the actual scope is until we start doing that work, I guess.
Exactly.
Yep. Awesome. So back on my Etherpad. Any other questions, firstly?
Nope.
Okay, back on my Etherpad. Thank you. No, back on my Etherpad, I have some dates, which are the absolute final dates that we need to that I think we need to follow, or we're going to run into the risk of letting this slip sorts. And I just made up these dates by looking at a calendar, right? Like, so the end of this week, I'm looking to get these first 10 patches merged. And the changes look minimal, the impact is high, as we discussed. So I mean, if you want, I can definitely share my run book as to how I am looking at each one of these changes. And I'll put that in a Etherpad and share that with you. And I'm hoping that I can get your thoughts on that as well. Like what are you thinking when you're looking at each one of these changes? But if we get all of these to merge, we have a much better idea of what the next set and the next set and the next set is, and it gets better from there. And I'm hoping to get these merged sooner than later because they have the tendency to break things. So it's best to catch them sooner than later. Yeah, so please take a look at these dates, and if you think that something is not is concerning, let me know, because that would be something we can fix right now, sorts. There are some precursor patches that have already been ready for a while. It's lines 10, 11, and 12. So if we can get these merged, I think, except this one. This one just came in yesterday night. So you can ignore this for a while, but these others which fix the way we're doing request context handling and fix some of the unit tests, that will be useful because the rest of the patches depend on them. So I can add you guys once I get back. Yeah. Do we have to discuss anything else today? And I'm so sorry for running on and running late and taking much more of your time than I asked for. But I'm finding this session really helpful to catch you up.
Yeah, Gautam. Yeah, definitely. Thanks. It's good knowledge transfer. And I, for one, this being new to this type of review, could use taking a look at your run book.
Yes.
If you want to share it, sure.
Yes, I'll do that right away, right after.
And I have some general ideas, like we were talking about. First, look at the unit tests and then the regressions and so forth. But I'm sure there's a lot in between we can.
Definitely, and I'll also include like the manual testing steps that I'm doing to qualify something in that run book.
Absolutely. Thanks.
No problem. Anything else? Awesome. All right. So I'll share the recording with the others. Thank you so much. Let me stop sharing and let me stop recording.